Wisp Sports Radio, the voice of women in sport.
Thank you for downloading Tucker Center Talks. This is Season 1, Episode 4. You're listening to Tucker Center Talks, a podcast from the Tucker Center for Research on Girls and Women in Sport at the University of Minnesota and a co-production with Wisp Sports. I'm your host for Tucker Center Talks, Dr. Nicole LaVoi, director of the Tucker Center. In this podcast, I'll have a conversation with two of my colleagues on a topic most everyone in sport is talking about, elite runner Mary Cain. I have great respect for and have invited on today to talk together with me about how scholars can help the public make sense of what we have recently learned about elite runner Mary Cain, the Nike Project, and Alberto Salazar and his coaching colleagues. I think after I introduce both of them, you'll know why I wanted to talk to them about this topic. So first invited guest is Dr. Julie McCleery, Director of Research to Practice Partnerships and lecturer at the University of Washington Center for Leadership in Athletics. Welcome, Julie.
Hi, thank you.
Our second guest this morning is Emily Stets, who's a program associate at the Aspen Institute for Sports and Society program and a fellow Minnesotan. Welcome, Emily.
Thank you so much for having me.
Both of these women have a lot of knowledge to share with us about leadership, coaching science, training coaches, and best practices across all levels of sport. So I'm really excited to dig in and start our conversation together. But before we get into my questions and conversation with them, I think for the listeners who may not be clued in to what we're talking about with Mary Cain, I just want to set the stage. So last week, Mary Cain, who is an elite runner, as she dubbed herself, one of the fastest girls in America until I joined Nike, was the title of her New York Times op-ed. And just to summarize, if you haven't read that article, which I would encourage you to do, and also the 7-minute video that goes along with her op-ed, the short story is that Mary was emotionally and physically abused by her coach, Alberto Salazar, and his male coaching buddies. She also claims that this system at the Oregon Project was endorsed by Nike. She endured what we might argue is abusive weight management, weighing in public, body shaming techniques that are not really effective coaching practices under anybody's opinion, I think. There were no certified sport performance professionals. She experienced disordered eating, loss of a menstrual cycle, and decreased bone mineral density, which led her to having many broken bones and also led her to self-destructive, self-harm behavior. So in short, the whole thing is very disturbing, perhaps not surprising. But I think the question that I want us to start with, and Julie, I'm going to kick this to you first, is what is your perception on how and why did this happen?
Gosh, there are so many reasons. I know we probably don't have time for all of them, but I want to first say that I think one of the reasons that this resonates so much with people and is getting so much attention is because it points out some systemic problems that are not just about Mary Cain, but are about our sports system in America in general. And that in that way, she's kind of serving as like a canary in a coal mine for a number of issues. But I would say I'll start with two of them. One is kind of our interest in short-term performance over long-term athlete development and athlete wellness. I think that's something that our American sports culture and youth sports culture hasn't figured out yet, that we have to make long-term investments in athletes so that are developmentally appropriate and sound, so that they can perform at high levels consistently over a long period of time. And then, I think it's important to note that in a lot of ways, I think this happened because we also have a sports culture that devalues women, that does not understand women, does not invest in improving that understanding of women's bodies, women as athletes, doing research to better understand ways to support women in sports. So those would be the two that I would start with.
The top two. Well, those are two great ones to start us off. So Emily, what are your perceptions on sort of the big picture reasons on why and how did this happen to Mary Cain?
For me, I think what resonates so much about this story and has made it possible has been this incredible Me Too conversation that took over the country, where folks actually started listening to women who were talking about abuse that they had experienced. And to me, when Mary Cain's story came out, the thing that rose to the top for me and other colleagues I've spoken with is that this is what happens anytime that an abusive person is given unchecked power. They create these toxic environments that have devastating human consequences, and the power that a coach has, not only over an athlete's training, especially for young women, but also their state of mind. When we have areas where we're glorifying and worshiping these institutions that are built to serve the elite few and not the masses of young people that can benefit physically and mentally and emotionally from participating in sports, this is another example of how we're institutionalizing the harm that Julie was talking about that are leading to these systemic problems. And it reminds me, in some ways, as a former collegiate runner and also as a former gymnast, it reminds me a lot of the machine that USA Gymnastics built, where they're funneling young girls through a very specific system, forcing them to fit a specific mold that, as Julie mentioned, focuses on that short-term performance at the expense of their long-term development and the impact that has had in other sports. So I see a lot of parallels there as well.
Yeah, and both of you mentioned this systemic problem that is protecting and almost creating abusive coach behaviors because there's no meaningful quality control for coaching effectiveness, staff management. So Salazar and his male coaching buddies were basically given all the power to do whatever they wanted without any checks and balances. And I think that's really problematic in terms of creating the system where these kinds of detrimental experiences happen for young people. And what's interesting to me is that this happens even though we have a lot of information about what effective coaching is. And so maybe let's turn to that, because the questions that I've been getting from the media is, well, what can coaching science and sports psychology and human development, what do we know that will help us do this better? And a lot of people don't realize the bodies of knowledge that the three of us already, think are common sense. The general public and maybe even some coaches don't know that. So what can we add to the conversation as scholars and people knowledgeable in coaching science that can help us add to this conversation? What are the best practices that we need to be adding? Emily, do you want to start?
Absolutely. I think aside from we know so much about the importance of coaches receiving proper training, not only in injury prevention, safety, conditioning, all of the sport-specific tactics that we think of when we think of high-performing athletes, but also middle school, high school, and collegiate athletes. But we also know that young people respond to and come back to programs where coaches are building supported environments. One of the areas that I'm passionate about that the Aspen Institute and other leaders, both in the youth development field and the youth sport field, are coming together to talk about is how coaches are creating supportive environments for young people to learn social and emotional skills through sports, which are things like communication, conflict resolution, teamwork, all of these other things. We know that these contexts and these environments help young people thrive in life and also have a direct impact on how they're working as a cohesive team. And we have an opportunity and an ability to help coaches create that environment. And looking at Mary Cain's story, which resonates with so many people because this issue has hit so many folks that I know and that I grew up with and trained with in the high school and collegiate level. It's hitting people because there is this understanding of the environments are not set up for young people to thrive and succeed, not only physically, but also emotionally and during a really pivotal time in their development. The other quick thing that I will say that the Aspen Institute research is also predicated on is this idea of asking athletes what they want and also what their experience is like. And so I'm curious also if we can, of the programs that take this opportunity to ask their athletes what their experience is like in a team setting. So say in a middle school or high school or collegiate setting, what if we took some of these questions about team culture to the athletes, ask them what their experience was like and what they would like to change, the kind of impact that could have?
Well, I think qualitative data like that can really be helpful in helping us understand the athlete experience, which oftentimes I think as adults, we assume we know what the experience is, but when we ask young people, and specifically girls and young women, what they tell us is often quite different than what we assume.
I really agree with Emily that this is an opportunity. It's an opportunity for us to kind of take stock nationally of some of these issues related to women's sports and sports and coaching in general. And one of those issues I think we need to pay attention to is how do we understand what it means to be a qualified coach? And we have such a decentralized system where we have different sports that have various ways of accreditation for their coaches, but we don't have a clear understanding of what qualifications are absolutely necessary for someone to be a youth sports coach or an elite performance coach for that matter. And I think that athletes and parents and the public in general, therefore, don't know what questions to ask. And we sometimes equate performance success with high quality coaching, and that isn't always the case. And we know that there are a lot of other things that go into actually creating that long-term sustainable performance, including this a healthy culture and one that focuses on athlete social emotional development and well-being right alongside of physical performance. So I think having a conversation about what coaching looks like as a profession and what the development of coaches should look like nationally would be a great starting point. I think some other things that we could pay attention to are the research practice gap. So I think, as you said, Nicole, there's a lot of coaching science out there, both on performance and mental health and sports psychology, but I don't think we really have, again, a system for figuring out how to get that information to the people on the ground who are the ones who need to implement that with athletes. And so we need to find a way to bring together researchers and clinicians and coaches in a collaborative way so that they can share information and learn from each other so that the science and knowledge that we do have is able to be delivered to the athletes to enhance well-being and performance.
I like those suggestions to add to what Emily said about what does it mean in the United States to be a certified, qualified, effective coach. A lot of the general public has no idea that we do not have a national level coach certification program like some of our colleagues do in Canada or Australia or the UK. We don't have a federal level qualified coaching certification program, which leads to a lot of problems because our coaches, depending on what sport they're in, may not have the proper training in the 8 domains of coaching that we know coaches need. Now, the 8 domains of coaching are based on standards set by the National Coaching Association for Coaching Education, which is philosophy and ethics, safety and injury prevention, physical conditioning, human growth and development, teaching and communication, sport-specific skills and tactics, and organization administration. And then how do you evaluate coaching effectiveness? It would be great if we had such an entity, and I think the work that a lot of us are doing in the coaching space, including the Aspen Institute and the center at UW and also here at Minnesota, you know, we're all just sort of working in our own vacuums, but this idea of coming together collaboratively with our collective knowledge, you know, that is starting to happen, but it needs to happen more and more. So let me pivot here to ideas about what you think, who is ultimately responsible for this whole situation? Because a lot of fingers are pointing in a lot of directions, but what do you think, Emily, who's responsible for this system? And perhaps how do we change the system, more importantly?
Boy, that is a tough question to almost look at what is it that drove all of this to occur. And one of the things that has stuck with me in the conversations I've been having is that while the coaching system is something, especially with with Alberto Salazar and the emotional and verbal abuse that he was able to get away with, and that was in some ways encouraged, it's almost too simplistic just to look at one coach and say this was the product. If we're able, you know, to just take this person out of the equation, none of this would have happened. Those of us who work within systems, within different industries, we know that it's not as simplistic as that. And Julie, I appreciated one of the things that you said about we have a youth sports system that is prioritizing short-term performance success over long-term holistic athlete development. And I think that's a really powerful statement to make, and also to understand the human impact behind that, because Mary Cain's story, while it's horrible and heart-wrenching, is not a new story. The conversations that I've been having, and even a lot of the experiences that I have had as a high school and collegiate runner, are mirroring and on this continuum of women's running, not just elite running, but on this continuum and on this spectrum. And I also agree, Julie, or you have some really salient points in addition about the measurement of success and looking at success as how many national titles do you have? What, how is it that you've been able to drop time in certain areas? We're looking at these false indicators of what success looks like and not actually looking more holistically at the young person and their long-term development. And one of the interesting ideas that I've seen thrown out there, I think came from Lauren Fleshman, who's another former American track and field runner in the 5,000. And I believe it was her, but she had an idea about what standards are we holding coaches to, and what would happen if we didn't prioritize how many titles you won, but instead prioritize the longevity of an athlete's career, or prioritize and rewarded coaches who had young people that came through their programming and they were, rated on the kind of culture that they're creating, as opposed to what these other stereotypical indicators of success are. And so, as difficult as it is to sort of pinpoint where in this system things broke down, I think once again, we have an opportunity now to look at a couple different intersecting points and say, where is it that we can use the tools and the science that we have, translate it into practice to provide some interventions and some tools for coaches so that these kind of environments and these kind of systems can be dismantled.
Yeah, I completely agree, Emily. As you're talking, the power that the coach is given in the system in every sport, almost, I would argue. And in this specific case, the coach has so much power. The athletes have so little power in the system. And the coaches and the system and the brands that manage them like to keep it that way because they want obedient, conforming, quiet, non-questioning athletes that will do whatever they tell them. And if they don't, they're the threat, whether it's perceived or real, is that they are not going to get to run or play, or that their funding or resources will be revoked, or they will be verbally or physically ridiculed and sanctioned. So the coach has an immense amount of power in the system, and I really think that has to change. There has to be some checks and balances. Julie, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think those checks and balances are all of us. I think we all have to be Mary Cain to make this system change. And every time that we let a coach get away with berating and shaming an athlete, whether it's, a child that we see at a tournament or whether it's something, that we see at a game that we go to, and we don't call that out, and instead we say, well, they won the game, so it doesn't matter. Every time we say that that's just sort of what sports is supposed to look like, we do a disservice to all athletes and to ourselves. And so I think what Mary has done is say, like, and I think the doping allegations against Alberto, she would say, gave her sort of the courage to stand up and say, I know this was wrong. I know now that this was wrong. And I think we all need to stand up and say, this is wrong, when we see behaviors that are not supportive of the kind of athlete development that we want to see. And, the youth sports in particular is like, it's a marketplace, right, where parents are the consumers and they get to choose the coaches that they have in the programs that they're in. And so I would ask parents to ask hard questions and to call out behavior that they see and they don't think is good for their kids. And, for athletes when they're going to colleges to, think about not just what is the success of that program, but how is that coach going to treat me as a person? So I think we all need to take it on if we want to change the system.
That's a really good point, Julie. And I was thinking, for those of us with the knowledge, if we saw, we all need to be Mary Cain. I love that. And I hope everyone listening is that everybody can do something to create change in the system, whether it's big or small. And those of us that are outside the system, let's say outside of the Oregon Project or outside this elite training program, if we were let inside, it would quickly become apparent to us that most of what was happening would not be deemed effective coaching practices. But the problem is that we're not allowed in. This is sort of a closed system where the abuse can persist, and that's precisely the way they want to keep it. So what you're arguing for is that people that get on the inside of the system, the coaches, the parents, although Mary Cain was really isolated and away from her social support and family system, the parents had no idea, but also empowering the athlete in the system to know this is not right sooner than what it takes until it completely falls apart and the damage is done. So I think that's such a good point that you bring up, Julie. Emily, do you have a follow-up to that?
I do, because I really do firmly believe that women's running is at an inflection point right now. And the sticking point for me, and what I really believe is going to break open the floodgates, is that, as I mentioned before, while this is an example of something happening at the elite level, the reason that it has resonated so much is that because environments like this are existing on a continuum within women's running environments throughout the country. So once again, young people in middle school, in high school, in college, D3 all the way to D1, it might not look exactly like Mary Cain's story, which, as you say, from the outside, the abuse is incredibly apparent. But there are other ways that this comes to life. There are implicit things that maybe coaches don't know that they're doing. Or I think even specifically back to my collegiate career, where you eat lunch and dinner with other athletes, and so you're maybe watching what other people are eating. There are places where the coaches aren't necessarily there, but once again, there's a culture. And what I'm curious and passionate about doing is taking and looking at this story, and in the vein of Julie saying, we all need to be Mary Cain and speak up, I want to understand how is it that we can continue to bring these conversations from the amateur and the recreational level into conversation, and once again, using a little bit of qualitative methodology and really asking people bluntly, what does this experience look like for you? What does it feel like? Whether you're competing, at an amateur level or just in a recreational program or at an elite level, how is it that we can harness this conversation and say, this is happening on a continuum. Women's running has struggled with this for years. And how can we harness sort of this Me Too moment, empower the athletes and young women runners so that they can be healthy and active for life and not drop out and be jaded and not want to go back to the sport or to exercise again.
Well, and as you're talking, Emily, I'm thinking about the very youth level program of Girls on the Run, which I would argue is doing it right. And they are asking girls on a national level because they have an evaluation program, which is being run by my colleague across the way here in the School of Kinesiology, Dr. Maureen Weiss and her research team. I would argue that other levels of sport have a lot to learn from what Girls on the Run is doing, which seems sort of counterintuitive to taking a youth level girls recreational running program and what can we learn in high performance sport from Girls on the Run. Julie, do you have some last thoughts on this before we wrap it up?
Gosh, yes, I have quite a few. I want to go back, Nicole, to something that you said when you're talking about the 8 domains of coaching. And I just wanted to point out that only one of those is sports specific knowledge. And, back to how we understand what quality coaching is, I think it's important that we recognize that there are 7 other domains, and a lot of them have to do with taking a holistic view of the athlete. And I think that is particularly important when we think about how we can bring more women into coaching. And it's not to say that women are necessarily the answer to a problem like this one, but they are a big part of the answer. And I know you know that, Nicole, so I'm preaching to the choir, but I think it's really important to note that there weren't any women around Mary Cain, and maybe that would have made things different for her. But for sure, having more than very low percentage, 25% of coaches in youth sports are women, and 40% of women's collegiate coaches are are women. And if I got those numbers wrong, I know you'll correct me, but that we need that cultural change. We need the strengths that women can bring to the coaching space in order to think more holistically, to bring different perspectives, to bring a different understanding, not of just women and girls' experiences, but of boys and men's experiences as well. And when we're starting this sort of national campaign to change the system, I think that's got to be a really important step that we would take.
Absolutely, Julie. You're speaking my language,
Yeah.
of course. More women into coaching, please.
Yes.
And Mary Cain herself in her video on the New York Times piece says this was one of the problems. She said we need more women in power in the system, and that might have helped her. And in track and field, it's actually a lot fewer women than 40%. In college track and field, it's less than 24%. I think it's around 18%. And maybe in the youth and high school ranks, it's around the same. But we know that certain sports like track and field, swimming and diving, water polo, there are very few women in these sports that are coaching, and that is very problematic for many reasons, which I will be sure to cover on future podcasts. Listeners, don't worry, we are going to cover this topic in depth in the future. Emily, final comments on this topic, maybe specific to girls and women in sport that we haven't covered yet?
I think what I'd love to end with as we springboard off this conversation about more women in coaching is looking a little bit down the road and saying, not only are there some interventions we can do now, but what might the future look like for the next generation of young women coming up? I was talking to my younger sister who had an incredibly successful multi-sport career in both gymnastics and most notably in track. And we were talking about not only women in coaching, but also what might it look like if young women and also men who definitely struggle with the same type of concerns that Mary Cain struggled with disordered eating and low bone density, among other things. We were looking at what might the world be if the women who had come up in that system went into coaching. And they said, here was this experience, I know what it doesn't look like. And in addition to bolstering some of what high quality coaching and evaluation systems look like, what would it look like if we got those people into coaching? And it reminds me a little bit, I'll be watching Slane Flanagan really closely. She's another American long distance runner who has recently retired after winning the New York Marathon, and now she is on the coaching side. And everything that she is advocating for and talking about, this is down the road, but I do believe that the conversations that we're having right now are going to affect this next generation that's coming up within this system, and they will in turn, with the proper supports, be able to create more supportive environments that they hopefully turn to in coaching down the line.
I love that, because one of the simplest strategies to get more women in the system is to invite them in. Ask them, we need you. Maybe you had a good experience, maybe you didn't, but you have knowledge that we need from you. Please help us change it for the ones coming behind you. And I think many of these young women want to do that. And so I really like that point. And I want to just end with a final thought of my own, is that I think a subplot to this conversation that I've heard come up a lot and I've seen on social media is that, what does it mean to coach girls and women? And I am going to cover that on a future and separate podcast, as I have many, many thoughts about this, as I know does Julie, because we've talked about this. But I think what I want to sort of plant the seed with the listeners is that when we ask of how do we coach girls and women, how that very question may reinforce outdated and damaging gender stereotypes about girls and women, and how it takes the focus away from what we already know about effective coaching practices. So for the listeners out there, stay tuned. That will be an upcoming podcast, because what I think we want to do is think big picture. Today, the flavor of the month is track and field. The flavor of the month before was gymnastics, USA Gymnastics and Michigan State. What is the next sport in line? Because let's not be naive. This is happening in all sports, because all sports are a bigger part of the system that, as we pointed out today with our guest, Dr. Julie McCleery and Emily Stets, that the system is broken, and it is particularly broken for girls and women. Final thoughts in one sentence, Dr. McCleery and Emily, what do you want our listeners to leave with in one sentence?
Well, I want to just take your point there, Nicole, about what will be the next sport, and I will ask us as a collective to be proactive.
I would say there is hope, and leave it at that.
I love that. We like to end on a positive message after we've just dismantled and critiqued the system. So thank you both for being part of this conversation on a very serious issue around abusive coaching behaviors in elite sport, and particularly around girls and women in sport. So thank you both for joining me today.
Happy holidays from Wisp Sports.
I'd love to hear from you, so tweet us at Tucker Center or to me directly at Dr. Sports Psych. Be sure to check out our website at tuckercenter.org and follow us on Facebook or Instagram. You can find the show notes with links and resources for this episode at wispsports.com. Look for Tucker Center Talks under the Listen tab, where you'll find many more conversations from the world of women's sport. Be sure to follow Wisp Sports on social media at Wisp Sports. And please share and follow or email with any questions, comments, or suggestions to info@wispsports.com. Thank you for listening and helping us turn up the volume on women's sports. That's a wrap for episode 4 of Tucker Center Talks. I'll be back next week for another episode where I will talk with Dr. Nancy Lowe at UNLV about marketing and promoting women's sport. You don't want to miss that conversation. I'm your host, Dr. Nicole LaVoi, signing off to make a difference in the lives of girls and women in sport.